Welcome. It's with great pleasure for me to introduce to you Vicky Hayes, our next author. She started writing stories, songs, and poems as a child in Paintsville, Kentucky. Like the protagonist of her first novel, Leaving Justice, she worked at a small-town newspaper. Her work has been published in Appalachian Heritage and other journals. Hayes and her husband direct an art nonprofit, Bobtown Arts, near Berea. If we could please give a round of applause for Vicky Hayes.
Some of the writers were talking earlier about voice and how important that is, that you know almost immediately in a book who's talking to you. Like if you're reading the newspaper and you see a Trump tweet, you know immediately it's Donald Trump. So voice comes out in a lot of ways from people, but the voice of the young girl here is a young journalist. She goes away to college and she comes home and she's right in the middle of the United Mine Workers strike. So I'm going to read just a little bit from the prologue because I think that establishes her voice. And then I'll read a little bit about a chapter that's based on a friend of mine who was a Berea College student many years ago in the 70s by the name of Jake Messer, who I visited once in the coal fields and talked with him a good bit about the fact that he loved to sabotage mining machinery. So this is one chapter that's actually based on an event that happened that I was near at the time, and I will read the prologue. On nights when the fog was heavy on the hills and there was no moon, the black coal cars rolled by unseen as the engine passed the road crossing. There were no warning lights on crossing bars. I cranked down the window and approached the track, listening for the sound of the cars. More than one driver had slammed his brakes as his headlight raked the line of coal cars clicking by. The smell of the damp earth and plants, the smell of oil dripping on the ballast covered up the night. The train cars full of stoker coal slipped heavily out of the narrow holler. I saw the caboose disappear into the timber, but still uncertain to move forward, I craned my head out the car window in its wake. I was home again. My headlight strayed, one like a bad eye, and wandered onto the coal bank. Darkness. The blackness of steel cars, the dark holes of trees, the beads of coal tumbled onto the right-of-way, the muddy slopes that ran like a canal along the two-lane were just another shade of night. Stoker coal shook from the big trucks and peppered the rights-of-way on Highway 23 until they turned black. There was a tipple near our home when I was growing up, just a mile as the crow flies, right across from the two-room school. The coal trucks rolled down Abbott Mountain and dumped their loads into the hopper where it was loaded onto train cars. You could fill a burlap bag in a few hours, more than you could carry, enough to stay warm all night from what fell along the roadside and the railroad tracks. We heated with coal in a cast-iron stove. My mother said it was like living with a drunk in the house. You never knew when it would overheat. So she stayed up on long frigid nights to feed and watch the fire. Every other spring we'd have to paint the walls a new shade of green or tan. The dust settled in a fine black powder on the walls and curtains. It darkened the sides of the house, even the trees as the train cars passed beside the main highway. To say nothing of how it stained the faces of the miners, sifted inside their clothes, and down into their lungs over time. In the deep mines, in long tunnels where there was not enough ventilation through the shafts, where Misha failed to do its job, the dust that hung heavy in the air waited for a spark to explode. The history of coal is boom and bust. Coming from the deep mine and the shovel to the gouged out holes of mountains where the topsoil and trees were slashed open by dozers, and the coal hauled out by drag lines was rolled down by the gargantuan Yuki trucks. Near the strip mines, the dust hung in the sky and the water turned black. Fewer and fewer men went to work every decade. Coming back home after my long absence, the cool spring nights bright with the smell of coal fires, the scent strikes my soul like a Baptist hymn at an altar call. It takes me back to who I was then. If you want to stand up and be counted on this earth, you better know where you come from and where you stand. Some stand with coal, like the bumper stickers you see that say Friends of Coal. And other bumper stickers, let the bastards freeze to death in the dark. Coal will define you one way or the other. In the way cotton defined the South, you either stand with labor or against it, with a union or with a company. You either stand for economic justice or you stand with money and power. And God help you if you ain't on our side, because the people are going to rise up. Arlie. And this is a chapter called Sabotage. Every person who has ever lived on this earth is an actor. We all have two selves, the one we present every morning when we get to work and the one that comes out in the evening when we come home. And when and how often do we ever say what we truly think? People live lifetimes in jobs and unhappy marriages like that because they just don't say what they think. They don't hash things out. The gap between my theatrical self and the suppressed self was growing larger every day. I still helped my mother clean the country club and the coal offices on weekend, and I was wearing the clothes their daughters discarded that were far better than anything I could afford. But I never told anyone where my clothes came from, not even Teresa, the typesetter at the office, at the newspaper. A sense of shame at working for the coal company as a cleaner overcame me each time we drove up the complex. But my mother worked there, and I didn't want to leave her. Justice was not served. Yet the only noble thing to do was pick a side and join a battle. I went forward with the belief that pacifism would fail the mountain people. Stories of resistance were coming out of the hills and hollers. The time was ripe for revolution, and I felt that the Mountain Star would be on the forefront of that change. It had always served the voices of the communities. And you may know this paper is the Mountain Eagle out of Whitesburg, Kentucky, that was burnt down several times by coal advocates. Tempers were flaring in small communities where the homes were fed by wells that had been damaged in the blasting along the ridges. They were desperate for clean water, hauling water from town and buying bottled water they could not afford. I could feel that something was in the air. For a moment, I wanted to be anywhere I was. I was thinking about the lake in Wayne Holler and how cool it would be in those deep, dark channels where the trees and mountains were undisturbed. The parking lot at the grade school in town was filled to capacity, with citizens attending the public hearing for water quality in 3 communities, despite the fact that officials held it in the middle of the weekday when people were working. There were church vans and 1 school bus unloading at the door. I saw the head of the health department standing next to the physician's assistant and the director of the Deer Creek Clinic, at a long table filled with canning jars containing water samples from the wells and creek. The pint jars contained dark water, some a gray murky shade, but most were the color of rust or ochre, nothing you could dream of drinking or even taking a bath in. The contamination is the result of groundwater pouring and seeping from the strip sites where minerals like arsenic and lead are exposed to the air. It pours down the watershed, seeping into the streams and wells that are fractured by the blasting. The rusty stains mark the sinks and bathroom fixtures and turn clothes brown in a washing machine. We ran stories and photos on water quality regular in the Star, often paying for the water samples. I stood there in the parking lot unloading my camera bag and thinking about how hopeless the situation was at that moment. It was a feeling I seldom indulged in. They were setting up the sound system, and I turned to see the number 2 man at National Coal, Ronald Brown, flanked by 2 men I assume were corporate security. There were state police posted at both entrances. I hated Brown more than anyone I had ever known. He had single-handedly done more to destroy the land in the Union than any one man in the history of coal. He could and would stand before a crowd and deny culpability. He was unshakable at the podium, calm in the face of anger and accusations, and he never veered from the story that he told. That reminds me of somebody else. He peddled the same rhetoric. Coal keeps the lights on. Coal is jobs. National built this community, and we are dedicated to supporting it. He could depend on a contingency of miners to show up at these hearings and testify, because he paid them to come. And when the press asked him if he would drink the water, he looked them straight in the eye, and he said, "Well, yes, I would." It so happened that Marshall's brother, the head of District 7 of the United Mine Workers of America, had begun his own private war. I got wind of this from Marshall, who told me that his brother Mull, over in Glow Holler was fighting a company to save his land. 5? Okay, thank you. If you want to go and talk to him, arrangements can be made. No one goes up that holler without an invitation. Glow Holler was so named for the slag pile that had burned for years along the main road. At night it appeared like a burning red snake writhing on the ground, and in daylight sulphurous smoke curled up from the slag heap left along a stream by a defunct coal concern. Glow Mart was the quick stop, and gas where the truckers pulled in and out of the pumps, picking up their Long Johns, hot dogs, and Pepsi. The sound of gears grinding and tires singing on the road drowned out all other sounds. But beyond the highway, the land was in timber, as we say. On Mull's home place, the trees stood uncut for hundreds of years. There were sizable poplar trees, oak, and history. He'd pulled logs out by a mule to hew and assemble a log cabin. Every inch of the lumber for the floor, roof, and trim came directly off that place. Mull was what others called eccentric because he was a purist in his craft. When he picked me up in his old four-wheel drive power wagon, we drove several miles up a sunken dirt road, crossed the creek twice, and jolted into a clearing. There were no power lines, phone lines, or any indication of modern life. This was life as his ancestors had lived it, down to the hewing axes, mauls, and planes and froes he used to mold the wood. And I'm going to jump to the scene in the woods. There's nothing crude about the cabin, I said. It has the mark of the craftsman. It's incredible, I said. I wondered if he would get it finished. Oh, I don't think on it, I just work. 600 acres in timber owned by 5 generations. The coal company is 5 miles to the west and maybe months away from this holler. We have to stop them now. By any means. We slow them down. Right now we work on the equipment on the small 2-acre sites. We go to the staging grounds and sugar the gas tanks. And when they start them up, it mucks up the engines. Oh, they'll just hire watchmen. And that's right. And we'll pull them out and we'll burn the shacks and then we'll set the equipment afire. And we want them to know what's coming. Well, the mine thugs will be coming because of the independent strike. The state police will set up shop. They'll be busy. National Coal has pushed the men as far as they will go. You can confirm them at the Union Hall. The contract expires in June. And I'll stop there. They go on up to she goes on up to the site with him and watches as he rigs all the equipment. And so this is right before the strike in the 80s that finished off the United Mine Workers of America, as much as automation finished off many of the coal jobs. So what you're hearing now about coal coming back and environmental regs being withdrawn, like now you may put bad water into the public streams. Coal is not coming back unless it's in a futuristic novel that we're able to conceive of, because the time for it's just passed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, we have some time for questions, so.
Could you talk a little about the role of research and history, combined with the fiction? How did you work from reality? How did you fictionalize?
Well, the 80s made national news, and the Louisville Courier-Journal had a lot of coverage. The Pike County newspaper had coverage. All the little weeklies, like the ones I worked at, they had a coal page, just a big whole segment in their paper. So as I was working on some of these stories in the places I went to, I also had all this newspaper coverage coming out continually, and I saved everything. I have 7 banker's boxes of newspaper clippings. And before I began to write, I went back, I looked at the clippings to try to be accurate. But also, Ursula Heggie says, well, I only use 8% of my research, and that's about the way it is, but you just want to know the place. So I used enough research to know how the strike worked, but mostly I wanted to focus on character.
And you invented the character.
I just invented the character. I thought, well, I'll make it a young person so she can be really hot-headed
Excellent.
and strong.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.